Imagine laying on a cold, stainless steel table, the scent of iodine stinging your nostrils, knowing that in 60 minutes, your 3-year nightmare is finally over. Your heart is racing, not from fear, but from the sheer electric weight of hope. But then the door doesn't open for a surgeon. It opens for a woman with a manila folder and a heart made of ledger paper. She doesn't see a teacher who spent 1,000 nights tethered to a machine. She sees a liability. She sees a number that doesn't add up. And just like that, the miracle is cancelled. The IV is coming out. The gown is being stripped. Nadia Reeves isn't dying because her body failed her. She's dying because her bank account did. This isn't a hospital room anymore. It's a courtroom where poverty is a capital offence. And the sentence? A slow, agonizing fade into nothingness. Nadia is lying there being told her life has a price tag she can't afford, while you sit here watching her world crumble for free. Don't be like Dr. Hendricks, taking everything and giving nothing back. Show us you value this story by hitting subscribe and telling us where in the world you're watching from right now. Don't just be a silent spectator in the dark. Prove your presence actually matters before the ledger closes and the miracle is taken away. The fluorescent lights of the pre-op suite didn't just illuminate the room, they stripped it of any warmth, reflecting off the linoleum floor, like ice. Nadia Reeves clutched the thin blue fabric of her surgical gown, her knuckles white. For 3 years, the sound of her life had been the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a dialysis machine, a thrumming reminder that she was living on borrowed time. But today, the hum was supposed to be replaced by the steady beat of a healthy heart. 6 out of 6 antigen match. A literal 1 in a million miracle. She could almost feel the phantom weight of the new kidney, a gift from an anonymous donor that promised her a future. She'd already planned her first day back in the classroom. She could see the faces of her students, hear the chalk on the board, feel the sun on her skin during a walk that didn't end in exhaustion. But the air in the room shifted the moment Dr. Patricia Hendricks stepped inside. The surgeon didn't look like a healer. She looked like an auditor. She didn't look at Nadia's face. She looked at the financial responsibility tab clipped to the front of her chart. The cost of the procedure is $280,000, Miss Reeves, Dr. Hendricks said, her voice as sterile as a scalpel. That's before the immunosuppressants, before the post-op monitoring, before the 24-hour nursing care you'll require for the first month. Nadia's breath hitched. My insurance. Medicaid is handling the bulk. I was told I was cleared. Medicaid covers the surgery, not the survival, Hendricks countered, finally looking up. Her eyes were devoid of empathy, fixed instead on the reality of the hospital's bottom line. You have no secondary insurance, no assets, no liquid capital to cover the $150,000 shortfall for your recovery period. Without that money, the transplant is a waste of a perfectly good organ. If you can't afford the medicine to keep the kidney alive, the kidney dies. And we don't waste organs at Mercy General. The room began to spin. Nadia looked at the IV port in her arm, already taped down, ready for the anesthesia. She looked at the clock. 5:48 a.m. Somewhere in this building, in a cooler filled with ice, a human organ was waiting for her. It was right there. It was her name on the box. But Dr. Hendricks was closing the folder with a sharp, final snap. We have another recipient on the list, Hendricks continued, gesturing for the nurse to enter. A businessman from the city. He's a 4 antigen match. Not as perfect as you, but his check cleared an hour ago. He can afford to stay alive. You, unfortunately, cannot. The humiliation was a physical blow. The nurse approached, not with a sedative, but with a pair of scissors to snip the plastic ID band from Nadia's wrist. It was the sound of a life sentence being carried out. They weren't just asking her to leave, they were asking her to go home and wait for the end. Every 10 seconds of silence felt like a minute of her life being stolen. Nadia's hands shook as she reached for her phone on the bedside table. Her vision was blurred by hot, stinging tears of rage and shame. She scrolled past the dozens of missed calls from her sister, past the get well texts from fellow teachers, down to a contact she hadn't touched in 3 years. A man named Judah. She remembered his eyes, dark, perceptive, and filled with a strange, quiet power. He'd told her she was a rare light in a dark world. He'd given her a number and told her it was a lifeline. She'd thought he was just a wealthy eccentric. Now she realized he was the only person she knew who didn't view life as a balance sheet. With the nurse hovering to reclaim the bed, Nadia typed the words that felt like a scream. "They're letting me die because I'm poor." I didn't know who else to call. She hit send, the screen's glow the only light left in her crumbling world. She didn't know that 5 floors down, in a private wing guarded by men who didn't wear scrubs, a phone was vibrating. She didn't know that the anonymous donor, the perfect 6 out of 6 match, wasn't just a stranger. He was the man she had just messaged, and he was currently watching the hospital's financial ledger on a tablet, a cold smile playing on his lips as he realized the hospital had just tried to sell his own kidney to the highest bidder. Nadia sat on the edge of the bed, the cold floor biting at her heels, waiting for a response that would either save her or let her slip into the dark. The silence in the room was deafening, a heavy, suffocating weight that felt exactly like the price of a pulse. The vibration of a smartphone on a tempered glass table shouldn't sound like a death knell, but in Judah Chae's world, every frequency has a price. He sat in the shadows of the hospital's VIP penthouse suite, a room Mercy General reserved for the kind of philanthropists who bought wings and named research centers. Judah wasn't there to buy a building. He was there to give a part of himself away. He looked down at the screen. The message from Nadia Reeves didn't just flicker. It burned. "They're letting me die because I'm poor." Judah didn't move. He didn't curse. He simply stared at the text until the blue light reflected in his pupils like a cold, digital fire. The world. He was a ghost. The man who dismantled the black market's most brutal organ rings from the inside. A shadow who decided who lived and who vanished. But, to the medical board of Mercy General, he was Donor 774, the anonymous savior whose rare, perfect match kidney was currently being prepped for transport. He had chosen this hospital specifically because of its reputation for excellence. He hadn't realized that excellence was gated by a credit score. He stood up, his tailored suit jacket catching the dim light. Beside him, his lead security detail, a man whose silence was more intimidating than most men's threats, waited for the command. Judah didn't give one. Instead, he pulled up the hospital's internal surgical schedule on a decrypted tablet. There it was. Patient, Reeves, Nadia. Status, cancelled, reason, insufficient funds. Directly below it, patient, Sterling, Arthur. Status, priority. Reason, paid in full. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. Judah had spent a lifetime navigating the darkest corners of human greed, but seeing it practiced in the sterile, noble halls of a hospital hit a different nerve. They weren't just practicing medicine, they were practicing math, and they had subtracted a human life because it didn't fit their equation. 5 floors below, the scene was far less quiet. Dr. Hendricks was already supervising the transfer of the transport cooler. She didn't look back at the room where Nadia was being forced to dress. Why would she? The product was moving to a more profitable consumer. She checked her watch. 6:05 a.m. Every minute the kidney sat on ice, its value technically depreciated. She needed it in Arthur Sterling's chest by 8 a.m. to ensure the bonus the board had promised her for a successful turnaround. Make sure the paperwork for the Reeves woman is filed as a voluntary withdrawal, Hendricks told the head nurse. But she didn't volunteer, doctor, the nurse whispered, her voice trembling. She begged. In this economy, being unable to pay is a choice to decline service, Hendricks snapped. Now move. She turned toward the elevator, but the doors didn't open. Instead, the entire bank of elevators hissed and locked. The digital displays above the doors went dark. Then the overhead lights flickered, transitioning from a warm white to a harsh, emergency red. The hospital's PA system crackled with a sound like static, followed by a voice that was low, calm, and terrifyingly certain. "This is not a drill," the voice echoed through the hallway, vibrating in the marrow of Hendricks' bones. "Mercy General is now under private audit. No one enters, no one leaves, and no one touches the organ in Bay 4. Hendricks froze, her hand still hovering over the call button. She looked at the transport cooler. Two men in charcoal grey suits, neither of them wearing hospital IDs, stepped out of the stairwell. They didn't look like doctors. They looked like the end of a career. Nadia, standing in the doorway of her pre-op room with her bag clutched to her chest, watched as the hallway transformed into a battlefield of silence. Her phone buzzed in her hand. One word, one name. "Judah. Stay put. I'm coming down." She looked up, the red emergency lights painting the walls the color of a warning. She had asked for a lifeline, but as the elevator doors finally groaned open to reveal the man from the fundraiser, she realized she might have summoned a storm. Judah stepped into the hallway, his eyes locking onto Dr. Hendricks with the precision of a predator. He didn't look like a donor. He looked like the owner of the world. And in that moment, the hospital's ledger began to bleed. The vibration of a smartphone on a glass table shouldn't sound like a death knell, but for Dr. Hendricks, it was the last thing she'd ever hear before the floor fell out from under her. You ever wonder what happens when a wolf walks into a den of sheep wearing white coats? It's not a massacre, not yet. It's the silence. That heavy, suffocating stillness that settles over a room when the person in charge realizes they are no longer the most dangerous thing in the building. Dr. Hendricks thinks she's holding a kidney. She doesn't realize she's holding a live grenade with the pin already pulled. She's built a career on the belief that everything has a price, that life is a transaction, and that the poor are just collateral damage in the pursuit of a balanced ledger. But as Judah Chae steps into the red-drenched light of the hallway, the math changes. The hospital isn't a place of healing anymore. It's a crime scene where the evidence is a human soul, and the man who owns the evidence has just arrived to collect. The air in the hallway didn't just turn cold, it turned sharp. Doctor, Hendricks stood paralyzed, her fingers twitching against the handle of the transport cooler. She was used to being the one who decided who breathed and who bled, but as Judah Chae walked toward her, she felt her authority evaporating like mist under a blowtorch. He didn't run, he didn't shout. His footsteps were measured, a rhythmic, predatory click-clack against the linoleum that seemed to sync with the frantic beating of her own heart. 10 seconds of silence felt like a lifetime as Judah stopped exactly 3 feet from her. He didn't look at the cooler. He looked through her, his eyes 2 dark voids that seemed to catalogue every lie she'd ever told. "You're moving my property," Judah said. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Your property?" Hendricks stammered, her voice cracking. "This is a medical facility, sir. You're interfering with a high-priority surgical transfer. Security is currently being relieved of their duties," Judah interrupted, his gaze shifting for a fraction of a second to Nadia, who stood trembling by the door. "And the transfer you're discussing involves donor 774. My kidney, my blood, my choice." The color drained from Hendricks' face so fast, it was as if someone had pulled a plug at her feet. She looked at the cooler, then back at Judah. The math was finally clicking, and the numbers were screaming. The anonymous donor wasn't a faceless name on a registry. He was the man standing in front of her with enough shadow market influence to buy and sell this hospital 10 times over before breakfast. "Mr. Chae, there must be a misunderstanding," she whispered, her arrogance replaced by a frantic, clawing need to survive. "The financial protocols. The protocol of greed." Judah stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor like a stain. "You told Miss Reeves that the organ would be a waste if the recipient couldn't pay for the aftercare. You decided that my gift was only valuable if it was sold to the highest bidder." Nadia watched from the periphery, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the way Judah's security team, men who looked like they were carved from granite, had already surrounded the transport team. They didn't have guns drawn, but they didn't need them. Their presence alone was a physical weight, a promise of violence held back only by a thin thread of their master's whim. Every 15 seconds, a new reality set in for everyone in that hallway. The hospital's rules no longer applied. Judah reached out, his hand hovering over the cooler. "I didn't give this part of me to a businessman with a fat checkbook. I gave it to a match, a perfect 6 out of 6. I gave it to her." He gestured toward Nadia without taking his eyes off Hendricks. "And you tried to steal it." "It's a matter of resource allocation," Hendricks cried out, a final, desperate attempt to hide behind her clinical coldness. "No," Judah corrected, his voice dropping an octave, becoming something ancient and terrifying. "It's a matter of theft, and in my world we don't file lawsuits for theft. We settle the debt in kind." The elevator doors behind him hissed open again. This time, it wasn't more security. It was a man in a rumpled suit, sweating profusely, the hospital CEO, Arthur Vance. He looked like he'd been pulled out of bed by his hair. "Stop everything!" Vance screamed, his voice echoing off the walls. "Dr. Hendricks, step away from that cooler right now. You're done. Your license, your position, it's over." Hendricks looked at the CEO, her mouth hanging open. "But Arthur, the sterling payment just bought you a one-way ticket to a federal investigation," Vance spat, his eyes darting to Judah with sheer, unadulterated terror. "Mr. Chae, please, we're correcting the error. The surgery for Miss Reeves starts now. On the house, everything, for life." Judah didn't look at the CEO. He looked at Nadia. For the first time, the ice in his eyes thawed, replaced by a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He had come to save her life, but as he stood in the red glow of the emergency lights, Nadia realized he had done something much more dangerous. He had claimed her. You see, the problem with a miracle isn't the price you pay to get it. It's the debt you owe once it arrives. And as the nurses rushed to get Nadia back onto a gurney, she realized that while the hospital was no longer her prison, she was now under the protection of a man who didn't believe in freedom. The silence in the hall wasn't a relief. It was a loop. You think the danger is over because the CEO stepped in? Think again. In this world, a free surgery isn't a gift. It's a takeover. As Nadia is wheeled toward the double doors, She isn't just a patient anymore. She's the centerpiece of a silent war. The air in the surgical wing has changed. It's no longer sterile. It's suffocating. The nurses who were ready to toss her into the street 10 minutes ago are now adjusting her pillows with trembling hands, their eyes darting toward the shadow in the hallway. They aren't afraid of a malpractice suit. They're afraid of the man who just proved that even the most powerful people in the city are nothing more than entries in his ledger. You can feel the shift in the room, can't you? That sudden, jarring realization that while Nadia's body is being prepped for a second chance, her soul might have just been collateral in a deal she never signed. The transition from the hallway to the operating room was a blur of stainless steel and sharp, blue fabric. Nadia Reeves lay on the gurney, the ceiling lights passing over her like strobe flashes. Each one felt like a heartbeat she wasn't sure she'd get to keep. The prep was different this time. It wasn't the routine, clinical efficiency of a hospital. It was a desperate, frantic scramble. The anesthesiologist, a man who had looked bored 5 minutes ago, was now checking her vitals with a fervor that bordered on panic. He knew. Everyone in this room knew that if Nadia's heart skipped a beat, their own might stop entirely. Up in the observation gallery, behind the reinforced glass, Judah Chae stood motionless. He didn't sit in the plush chairs provided for VIPs. He stood at the edge, his silhouette cast downward into the OR like a dark omen. To any other patient, a donor is a ghost, a nameless, faceless memory. But for Nadia, looking up through the haze of pre-medication, her donor was the only thing that felt real. He was the 6 out of 6 match. He was the man who had walked through fire to put her back on this table. "Vitals are stabilizing," a nurse whispered, though she wasn't talking to the lead surgeon. She was looking at the glass, waiting for a nod from the shadow above. The problem with being saved by a monster is that you never know when the bill is going to come due. Every 10 seconds, the monitors chirped, a steady, rhythmic reminder that Nadia was still here. But as the anesthesia began to take hold, as that heavy velvet curtain started to drop over her consciousness, she didn't feel the peace she'd expected. She felt a weight. It was the weight of a gaze that didn't just see her medical history, but her future. Judah wasn't just giving her a kidney, he was planting a flag. Outside the OR, the world was still trying to catch up to the Ghost King's sudden appearance. Arthur Sterling, the businessman who had tried to buy Nadia's miracle, was currently being escorted out by men who didn't work for the hospital. He had shouted about his lawyers, about his donations, about his right to the organ. He'd learned very quickly that in a room full of sharks, there's always a leviathan. Judah hadn't even looked at him. He'd simply whispered a name to his assistant, and Sterling's entire corporate empire began to vibrate with the first tremors of a total collapse. Scale of 1 to 10, how much do you want to live, Nadia? Judah's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from that fundraiser years ago. She'd laughed then, thinking it was a flirtatious joke. Now, with the cold sting of the sedative entering her vein, she realized it was an interview. He had been screening her. He had been waiting for the moment the world failed her so he could prove he was the only thing that wouldn't. The lead surgeon, a replacement brought in from the department head's office, stepped into the light. The scalpel caught the overhead glare, a silver tooth ready to bite. He looked up at Judah, a silent plea for permission, and received a single, slow blink. The work began. You see the way the light hits the glass. It creates a reflection where Judah's face is overlaid on Nadia's. He isn't just watching a surgery, he's watching a rebirth. The scalpel descended, the skin parted, and for the first time in 3 years, The clock stopped being a countdown to death and started being a countdown to a debt. Nadia's eyes rolled back, the darkness finally claiming her. But the last thing she saw wasn't the white light of a hospital. It was the dark, unyielding silhouette of the man who now owned the very air in her lungs. The room fell into a heavy surgical silence, a loop of breath and steel that promised one thing: life at any cost. Nadia's debt to the Ghost King is just beginning, and yours to this story is too. You've watched her struggle and her rebirth, but walking away now without subscribing is exactly what the predatory Dr. Hendricks would do, taking the value and leaving nothing behind for the creator. Don't let this miracle go to waste in your algorithm. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to ensure you don't miss the moment the bill finally comes due. It's the very least you can do for a story that is giving you its own blood and bone today. Waking up shouldn't feel like a threat. Usually the first breath after a major surgery is a victory, a gasping, desperate, "I'm still here." But for Nadia Reeves, the air in her lungs doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a loan. She opens her eyes not to the peeling wallpaper and flickering bulbs of the general ward, but to a room that looks like it was plucked from a billionaire's penthouse in Seoul. There's no smell of bleach here, only the scent of expensive lilies and the cold, metallic tang of absolute power. The problem isn't that she survived. It's that she survived into a world where the exits have been replaced by silent men in tailored suits. You see, when a ghost saves your life, he doesn't just walk away. He stays in the corner of your vision, waiting for the moment you realize that the debt you owe isn't one you can pay back with a thank you note. The first thing Nadia noticed wasn't the lack of pain, but the silence. In the dialysis clinic, silence was a luxury. There was always the groan of the plumbing, the frantic beeping of a failing pump, or the low-stakes gossip of overworked nurses. Here, the silence was thick, heavy, and expensive. She shifted her head on the silk pillowcase, her eyes landing on a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked a skyline she barely recognized. This wasn't the view from Mercy General. This was the view from the top of the world. A soft chime echoed in the room, and the door slid open with a whisper. A nurse entered, but she didn't look like any nurse Nadia had ever seen. Her scrubs were custom-fitted, her movements as precise as a clockwork doll. She didn't check the IV bag, she scanned a tablet that looked like it belonged in a research lab. "Your vitals are exceptional, Miss Reeves," the nurse said, her voice devoid of the usual hospital fatigue. The transplant was a textbook success. The donor organ has already begun to function at 80% capacity. Nadia tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was lined with glass. She managed a raspy whisper. Where am I?" "You are in the private medical suite of the Chae Corporation," a new voice answered. Judah was standing in the doorway, the light from the hallway framing him like a dark halo. He'd traded his suit for a black cashmere sweater, looking less like a Mafia boss and more like the guardian of a very private, very dangerous secret. He stepped into the room, and the air seemed to move with him, pressing against Nadia's chest. Every 10 seconds, the weight of his presence grew. "You weren't safe at Mercy. General," Judah continued, walking to the foot of her bed, "Dr. Hendricks wasn't the only one looking to profit from your misfortune. Once the board realized who I was, they tried to turn your recovery into a PR stunt. I don't do stunts." Nadia watched him, her heart skipping a beat. Not from a medical glitch, but from the realization that she was now a variable in a much larger equation. You were the donor," she whispered, the weight of it finally sinking in. "Your kidney. Why?" Judah's eyes didn't soften. If anything, they sharpened, dissecting her even as she lay there recovering. 3 years ago, you told me that light shouldn't be hidden in dark places. You were volunteering at a fundraiser for people you didn't know, for a cause that didn't pay you a cent. You were a rarity, Nadia, a person who gives without expecting a return. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. I am not that kind of person. I don't give. I invest. The tension in the room snapped like a violin string. Nadia felt the IV in her arm, the one providing the medicine she couldn't afford, and realized it was a tether. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a project. "What do you want from me, Judah?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. He straightened up, the shadow returning to his features. "Right now, I want you to heal. I want you to eat the food my chefs prepare, take the medicine my labs developed, and sleep in the bed I bought. I want you to realize that the world that tried to let you die no longer has a claim on you." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door, his hand on the handle. "But understand this, Nadia. I saved your life because I decided it was worth more than the money they wanted. That means, for the foreseeable future, your life belongs to the man who deemed it valuable." The door closed with a click that sounded like a vault locking. Nadia looked back at the skyline, the beautiful, glittering city feeling more like a prison than ever before. The monitor beside her bed chirped, a steady, rhythmic reminder of the life he had given her. A life that was now a ledger entry in the Ghost King's book. The silence returned not as a comfort, but as a loop of the debt she could never hope to settle. Do you ever feel like you're a ghost in your own life? That's the reality hitting Nadia Reeves as she walks the marble halls of the Chae estate. Her body is healing, the stitches are fading into silver lines, but the weight in her chest, the literal piece of someone else inside her, feels heavier than the illness ever did. She's no longer the woman who stood at the front of a classroom with a piece of chalk and a dream of traveling. She's a ghost inhabiting a museum of someone else's power. Outside those high, electrified fences, the world is still moving, still grinding people down for $1. But inside, time has stopped. Judah Chae doesn't just own the ground she walks on, he owns the air she's breathing. And as she approaches the heavy mahogany doors of his study, she realizes that the miracle didn't just save her life, it redefined who owns it. The hallway was a gallery of ancient artifacts and modern security sensors, a marriage of old-world elegance and new-world paranoia. Nadia's bare feet were silent on the cold stone as she moved toward the only light in the wing. She should have been in bed. The nurses had been clear about her recovery schedule, but the silence of the estate wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, and it was pulling her toward the center of the storm. She stopped outside the double doors of Judah's study. They were slightly ajar, a sliver of amber light spilling onto the floor. She expected to hear the clinking of a glass or the rustle of paper. Instead, she heard a voice that sounded like grinding stones. It was Judah, but the warmth she'd felt in the hospital was gone, replaced by a clinical, terrifying detachment. "Arthur Sterling's offshore accounts in the Caymans? Freeze them," Judah said. There was a pause, presumably for the person on the other end of the line. "I don't care about the legality. I want him to wake up tomorrow and realize he can't even afford a cup of coffee. He tried to buy my blood. Now, I'm going to make sure he bleeds out, financially speaking." Nadia's breath hitched. Arthur Sterling, the man who had almost taken her kidney. She leaned closer, her heart hammering against her new organ. "And Dr. Hendricks," Judah continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor blade. "Ensure the medical board receives the unedited footage of the pre-op suite. I want her stripped of her license, her pension, and her reputation. Then, buy the debt on her primary residence. I want her to know exactly what it feels like to have a ceiling taken away because the math didn't favor her. Every 10 seconds, another life was being methodically erased. It wasn't justice, it was an execution. Nadia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She had spent her life believing in the system, in the slow, grinding wheels of fairness. Judah was bypassing the wheels and simply burning the factory down. She pushed the door open just an inch. Judah was sitting behind a desk carved from a single piece of obsidian. On the screens behind him, data flowed like digital rain. Bank records, security feeds, flight manifests. He looked up, his eyes finding her in the darkness of the hallway with unnerving speed. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd been waiting for her to stop pretending to be asleep. "You should be resting, Nadia," he said, the ice in his voice softening just a fraction, though his eyes remained fixed on the data of his victims. "You're destroying them," she whispered, stepping into the light. "Sterling, Hendricks, you're not just stopping them, you're erasing them." Judah stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the room. "The world is a ledger, Nadia. They tried to put you in the loss column. I'm simply balancing the books." He walked around the desk, his movements fluid and dangerous. "They didn't just try to let you die. They tried to commodify a gift. In my world, that is the only sin that cannot be forgiven." "But at what cost?" Nadia asked, her voice trembling. "Is this what my life is now? A reason for you to ruin people?" Judah stopped inches from her, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold metal surrounding her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly gentle given the words he'd just spoken. "Your life is the only thing in this room that has value. Everything else is just noise." He looked down at her chest, where the surgical scar was hidden beneath a silk robe. "You have my heart in a way most people couldn't understand. That makes you the most protected person on the planet. And the most dangerous." The tension spiked as a notification chimed on his desk. A red file flashed. Target neutralized. He didn't even look at it. He kept his eyes on her, a silent promise that the miracle was just the beginning of a total takeover. Nadia looked at the screens, then back at the man who had given her a part of himself. She was breathing. She was alive. But as the clock on the wall ticked, a steady, rhythmic sound that mimicked the pulse in her wrist, she realized that she hadn't escaped the hospital's ledger. She had just been moved to a private book, one where the ink was never dry. The silence of the study wasn't a comfort, it was a loop. You ever feel the weight of a secret so heavy it changes the way you walk? For Nadia, that secret is a rhythmic thumping in her chest that isn't entirely hers. It's the constant reminder that her miracle was harvested from a man who spends his nights deciding which empires should fall. She's standing in the middle of a marble-floored prison, watching the man she thought was her savior turn into the architect of a world she doesn't recognize. The gratitude is still there, but it's starting to curdle into something sharper, something more dangerous. Because in Judah Chae's world, there is no such thing as a free life. There is only the cost of maintaining the status quo. And as the doors of his private terminal hiss open, Nadia realizes that the hospital room was just the waiting area. The real operation is about to begin, and she's the only one without a scalpel. The black SUV moved through the rain-slicked streets of the city like a shark through dark water. Inside, the air was conditioned to a perfect, sterile coolness that reminded Nadia too much of the OR. Beside her, Judah was silent, his eyes fixed on a tablet displaying logistics for a shipping port she'd never heard of. He hadn't asked her to come. He'd simply handed her a coat and pointed toward the door. It wasn't an invitation. It was an induction. "You look like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop," Judah said, not looking up from the screen. Nadia gripped the leather upholstery. "I'm waiting to find out if I'm part of the business or just the cargo." Every 10 seconds, the streetlights outside flickered across Judah's face, revealing and then hiding the hard lines of a man who hadn't slept in a week. "You're the only thing that isn't business, Nadia. That's why you're here. I need you to see what resource allocation actually looks like when it isn't being managed by a woman in a white coat." The car came to a halt in front of an unassuming warehouse on the edge of the docks. Men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by shadows, stood at the entrance. They didn't salute. They simply stepped aside. As Nadia followed Judah into the cavernous space, the smell hit her. Not the stench of rot she expected, but the sharp, biting scent of medical-grade disinfectant and ozone. In the center of the warehouse stood rows of high-tech cryogenic units, each one humming with a low-frequency vibrate that made the marrow in Nadia's bones itch. This wasn't a smuggling den. It was a vault. "The world thinks I'm a ghost who controls the black market," Judah said, walking toward a central console. "They're half right. I don't run the rings. I break them. And then I take what they stole and I put it back where it belongs." He tapped a key, and the screens above them illuminated. Names, ages, blood types, thousands of them. Sterling and Hendricks were small-time predators. They used a hospital to hide their greed. The people who built this warehouse use the entire planet. They take from the poor to sell to the desperate. I take from the thieves to give to the forgotten. Nadia walked toward one of the units. Inside, suspended in a shimmering, nutrient-rich fluid, was a heart. It looked small, fragile, and utterly priceless. "Is this what you did for me?" she whispered, her voice lost in the hum of the machinery. "Did you take me from a list and put me at the top?" Judah stopped beside her, his presence a wall of heat against the warehouse's chill. "I didn't have to. You were already at the top of my list. But the others, the ones who don't have a ghost king looking out for them, they die in hallways while people like Arthur Sterling buy their way to the front." He turned to her, his eyes dark with a conviction that bordered on fanatical. "You asked me why I saved you. It's because you were the only person who looked at me 3 years ago and didn't see a bank account or a threat. You saw a man. And that man decided that if the world was going to be a ledger, he was going to be the one holding the red pen." The tension in the room wasn't just in the air. It was in the realization that Judah wasn't a hero. He was a vigilante of the blood, a man who had decided that the only way to fix a broken system was to own the wreckage. "What happens to the people who run this place?" Nadia asked, her gaze moving back to the heart in the tank. "They're currently learning that some debts can't be paid in cash," Judah replied, his voice flat. He reached out, taking her hand. His skin was warm, a jarring contrast to the cold steel surrounding them. Nadia felt the pulse in his wrist, strong, steady, and terrifyingly certain. She realized then that she wasn't just a survivor of a medical crisis. She was a witness to a revolution. And as the lights in the warehouse dimmed, leaving only the blue glow of the life support systems, she felt the loop tightening. She was alive because of a man who destroyed lives to save them. The hum of the vault became the background noise of her new reality, a steady, rhythmic reminder that in the Ghost King's world, every breath is a victory, and every victory has a body count. You think the biggest threat to a transplant patient is rejection, but you're looking at the wrong kind of failure. It's not the kidney that's the problem. It's the vacuum left behind when you take down an empire. When Judah Chae dismantled the Sterling family and gutted Mercy General, he didn't just clear a path for Nadia. He pulled the pin on a regional power struggle. Now, the silence of the estate isn't peaceful anymore. It's the sound of a predator holding its breath. Nadia is standing in a room full of glass walls, realizing that her survival has made her the ultimate leverage. The man who gave her a part of himself is finally showing the cracks in his own armor. The donor surgery wasn't just a gift. It was a physical toll he wasn't prepared to pay while fighting a war on 3 fronts. The miracle is starting to feel like a target. The alarm didn't scream. It was a low, pulsing vibration in the floorboards of the master suite, a digital heartbeat that told Nadia the perimeter had been breached. She stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the reinforced glass. Down in the courtyard, the shadows were moving, too fast and too organized to be the wind. These weren't the cleaners Judah employed. These were the ghosts of the industry he'd tried to burn down. She turned as the door to her room hissed open. Judah stepped in, but he wasn't the invincible ghost king she'd seen in the warehouse. He was pale, his hand pressed firmly against his side, just above the hip where the surgeons had taken the organ that now lived inside her. A dark stain was blooming through the fabric of his black shirt. The exertion of the last 48 hours, the raids, the liquidations, the calculated ruin of his enemies, had torn through his own recovery. "Get in the safe room, Nadia," he commanded, his voice a ragged shadow of its former self. "You're bleeding," she whispered, the irony hitting her like a physical blow. The man who had saved her life because she was a rare light was now dimming right in front of her. "It's a minor complication," Judah grunted, though the way he leaned against the doorframe suggested otherwise. Every 10 seconds his breathing became more labored, a rhythmic struggle that echoed the tension in the hallway outside. "They aren't here for me. They're here to reclaim the assets I took from the docks. They think if they take you, I'll hand over the codes to the cryogenic vaults." Nadia felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. To the world, she was a success story. To Judah's enemies, she was a 150-pound bargaining chip. The realization was a jagged pill she couldn't swallow. Her life was the only thing keeping the vault doors closed. The sound of suppressed gunfire muffled by the thick walls echoed from the floor below. Judah's security team was engaged, but the Ghost King was currently a king without a throne, trapped by his own physical sacrifice. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a sleek, obsidian-colored handgun, handing it to her. The metal was cold, heavy, and felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever taught in her classroom. "I can't do this, Judah," she said, her hands shaking as she took the weight. "You have to," he countered, his eyes locking onto hers with a desperate intensity. "The world is trying to put you back in that hospital gown, Nadia. They want to turn you back into a number on a ledger. Are you going to let them?" She looked at the gun, then at the man who had literally emptied himself to fill her. The tension in the room was suffocating. Outside, the sound of boots on the stairs grew louder. The resource allocation was no longer happening in a boardroom or a warehouse. It was happening right here, in the space between her heartbeat and his. Nadia realized then that the transplant hadn't just changed her blood. It had changed her frequency. She was no longer the victim waiting for a call at 2 a.m. She was the one holding the line. She watched the door, her finger finding the trigger guard, her new kidney pulsing with a steady, defiant rhythm. Judah slumped slightly, his strength flagging, but his gaze remained a fixed point of gravity. "They think you're the weakness," he whispered as the door handle began to turn. "Show them you're the investment." The door burst open, and the first of the tactical team stepped into the light. Nadia didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She stood in front of the man who had saved her, a living shield for the donor who could no longer shield himself. The loop was closing. The life he gave her was now the only thing standing between him and the dark. The silence of the room was gone, replaced by the roar of a woman who had finally decided she was worth the price. You ever wonder what it feels like when the person you were dies and someone else takes their place? Nadia Reeves didn't just get a new kidney. She got a new soul. She's standing in the wreckage of a billionaire's dream, holding a weapon she never wanted, protecting a man who destroyed the world just to keep her breathing. The fear is gone. The uncertainty is gone. In its place is a cold, hard clarity that only comes when you realize that mercy is just a word people use when they don't have the power to take what they want. The attackers in the hallway think they're fighting a teacher who's lucky to be alive. They don't realize they're fighting the most expensive investment the Ghost King ever made. And tonight, the dividends are being paid in iron and fire. This is the end of the line, the moment where the victim becomes the victor, and the cycle of debt finally comes full circle. The lead mercenary didn't even have time to register the woman in the silk robe before the world exploded into a cacophony of kinetic energy. Nadia didn't pull the trigger. She didn't have to. As the doorframe splintered, the cleaners she'd seen at the warehouse materialized from the shadows of the master suite, like ink dropped in water. They weren't just security. They were an extension of Judah's will. In 10 seconds, the hallway was a graveyard of ambition. The men who came to reclaim assets were nothing more than stains on the marble. Nadia stood frozen, the obsidian handgun still heavy in her grip. She looked down at Judah, who was slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow but his eyes burning with a dark, triumphant pride. He had seen it. He had seen the moment she stopped being a patient and started being a partner. The threat is neutralized, Judah rasped, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips as a medic in tactical gear rushed to his side. You planned this, Nadia whispered, the realization hitting her harder than the gunfire. You knew they'd come. You used yourself as bait to draw out the last of the sterling loyalists. Every 10 seconds, the reality of her new life settled deeper into her bones. Judah didn't deny it. He just watched her, the silence of the room returning, heavier and more permanent than before. I told you, Nadia. I don't give, I invest. To protect the investment, I had to prune the garden. 2 weeks later, the world looked very different for Nadia Reeves. She wasn't back in a classroom. She was standing in the lobby of what used to be Mercy General. The gold lettering on the wall had been scraped away, replaced by a simple, elegant plaque. The Reeves Institute for Equitable Care. Dr. Hendricks was gone, her name a cautionary tale in medical journals. Arthur Sterling was a ghost, his assets liquidated into a trust that funded thousands of transplants for people who couldn't afford it. The system hadn't been fixed, it had been conquered. Nadia walked through the sterile halls, her footsteps echoing with a confidence that made the new staff drop their heads in respect. She wasn't just a donor recipient anymore. She was the face of a new regime. She reached the executive office, the room where she'd been told she wasn't worth the cost of the surgery. She sat in the chair once occupied by the CEO, looking out at the city she now helped rule. The door opened and Judah entered. He walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the piece of him that now beat inside her. He didn't speak. He just placed a manila folder on her desk. Inside was a list of names, the new unaffordables, the ones the world had forgotten. Who's first? Judah asked, his voice the only thing that felt grounded in this new, glittering reality. Nadia looked at the first name on the list. A young man, a musician, denied a heart because his credit score was too low. She picked up a red pen, the same red pen Judah had described in the warehouse. She circled the name with a steady hand. "He's a perfect match," she said, her voice sounding exactly like the authority she once feared. You see, the world likes to tell you that life is a gift. But as Nadia looked at the man who had died for her to live, and the man who had killed for her to rule, she knew better. Life isn't a gift, it's a transaction. And as she felt the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the building's new heart, she realized she was finally the one holding the ledger. She leaned back in the chair, the scent of expensive lilies filling the room, and thought back to that cold Tuesday at 2 a.m. She remembered the sound of the nurse snipping her ID band. She remembered the feeling of being a number that didn't add up. The ledger is officially closed, and Nadia has finally taken the red pen for herself. Now, the only question remaining is whether you'll be on her list of survivors or left in the cold shadows with the rest of the forgotten. If you've made it through this entire journey and still haven't subscribed, you're choosing to be a ghost in a world that only values the loyal. This is your final chance to join the elite who understand the true price of power and storytelling. Subscribe now or risk being the one the world decides isn't worth saving next time. The choice is yours, but the clock has officially stopped.